Thank you very much indeed, Doran, and thank you so much for this invitation to present at the Geary Institute seminar. This is the first outing of this paper, so I'm looking forward to any comments and suggestions that people might make in the Q&A towards the end. This is my main COVID paper, I think you might say. Many people have observed and some participated in COVID studies over the last 2 years, obviously, dropping what they would otherwise have been doing to meet the global emergency, including the social sciences. And my own personal contribution, on the one hand, in the middle of the first lockdown, I was so taken by the enormous loss of learning that was going on in schools, being at the Institute of Education in London. And I attempted to quantify that and wrote one paper on that in the middle of 2020. That's now a year and a half ago. But this is an altogether different study based on new evidence. I joined about a year ago a new study focusing on young people and health, particularly their experiences of various outcomes during the COVID period. So the attempt is basically the whole study to try and understand the effect of COVID on young people and health, not only in Britain, by the way, it's international, looking at Germany and Canada and other countries as well. Well, among COVID's many effects, the thing which particularly interested me, given my interest in job skills, is the impact on the acquisition of job skills and potential loss of learning amongst young people. And so this became also a focus of our new study, Young People's Employment and Health. For young people, let's move on. For young people, the context really of this study is not only COVID, but the implications of Brexit and the fact that a large number of skilled workers have left Britain and are not coming to Britain who might otherwise have done so, leaving potential skill shortages, so that both from the individual point of view from COVID, the potential scarring of not getting a job or not getting access to learning of job skills, the potential scarring for individuals, but also potential skill shortages in the future. It struck me that it was pretty important to try to understand what was happening here from a number of different points of view. In other words, what I'm saying is that I think the potential loss of learning of job skills was one important component of the of COVID's many effects. The problem is, and now moving to my second bullet point there, how hard it is to measure the loss of learning of job skills. You might, and indeed some studies have looked closely at inspectors' reports, teachers' reports, data on that, and inferred things from data on lost school time, lost learning time. You find this in a number of countries. But all that is kind of general loss of educational progress, and it's usually on the input side. What I was interested in is any data we could obtain on loss of learning of job skills, skills relevant for work. And so the approach that we take in this study is to ask young people directly themselves for their own perceptions of their loss of job skills. So this is the innovative method, really, for the approach. It has some problems. Of course, it's entirely subjective. The responses I'm going to look at today are entirely subjective and have their own biases appropriately from that approach. But in defense of our approach, we would say first that actually people's perceptions of their loss of learning are known in themselves, whether or not those perceptions are correct, to have important effects on their well-being. There are some studies showing that. And secondly, in any case, this is the only way we could think of to actually gain data, to gain an impression of how severe it was. So with all the problems of subjective, purely subjective data, this is how we proceeded. So what could be expected as a result of the COVID pandemic on the loss of learning of job skills? In other words, here you have young people. We're actually going to be looking at people aged 16 to 25. They're either about to make the transition from education into work, or they've already done so. And then the pandemic comes along. First of all, we could expect some direct effects. That is to say, if someone in your family, a close family member, is very badly affected by the disease, hospitalized and so on and so forth, we can expect some major psychological and practical disruptions to people's learning there. But secondly, obviously, there are indirect effects from the lockdowns and all the restrictions that were made upon everybody in most countries, either interrupted transitions, that is to say, people not going from schooling into work in the ways they might have otherwise done, or indirect effects within education and within employment. So that obviously within education, the biggest loss is loss of learning time and potentially much lower quality of learning through online processes. And for those in employment, big questions for me when we started out was what actually happens to training, regular training, whether apprenticeships or more regular training. And what about all those hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people who were placed on furlough? What about the acquisition of job skills for them? So the main questions, I mean, there are lots of subsidiary questions. The main questions we looked at in this study is, first of all, how much, if at all, are young people's perceptions of their learning losses associated with having had a direct personal experience of COVID-19? That's for that minority, substantial minority, who had a direct experience, how bad was that effect on their perceptions? Do then their perceptions vary according to whether they're in education or in work or neither? Thirdly, looking at those people in education, how is their perception of COVID's effects associated with the delivery of education, and can it be mitigated at all, for example, if they have access to work experience? Fourthly, for those in work, and I would say probably just about the modal number of our sample are in fact in work, how was their training affected? Did their training collapse? What was the effect of being placed on furlough? Lots of young people were placed on furlough. And what was the effect of luck? If you happen to be working in hospitality, which is one of the classic lockdown industries, which basically couldn't operate for months on end. And then fifthly, what about the individual? Some people have much more personal resources than others, and particularly if you've got some kind of long-term disability, or you come from a very disadvantaged household, then perhaps you can't deal with the effects so well. And finally, what about gender? We know that there were strong gender differences, strong gender effects in many outcomes during the COVID pandemic. Does that lead to different perceptions of skill loss amongst young men and young women? So those are the questions we wanted to look at. And now I'm going to talk about the data. The data we collected well, first of all, we used existing data from the QLFS, the Quarterly Labour Force Survey, which collects regular data every year on training and training participation and whether they're in work or not, and so on and so forth. And these are large samples, or reasonably large samples. And so we were able to use that data specifically to look at the training story. But in order to look at the main story, we commissioned our own survey, an online survey of young people, young being defined for this purpose is between 16 and 25. And there are altogether to be 6 waves of this project, which are still ongoing, in fact. And this paper I'm presenting today is based on the first 3 waves, February, April, and July of last year, late July of last year. The online survey is taken from a panel sample that is run regularly by Ipsos, the survey company. It is a quota sample, which obviously has disadvantages, which means, well, one advantage is that we have a guaranteed sample size of 1,000 in every wave. And I'll come to the quota sample bit in a moment. But just to say, we then designed our own questionnaire, and it covered all sorts of perceived COVID effects on employment, education, mental health, and so on and so forth, as well as kind of standard indicators of education, employment, their well-being, and their aspirations for the future. So there are other papers coming out of this project looking at things like the effects on students' aspirations. Incidentally, the data will be made public, and I think the first 3 waves probably already has been put down at the UK Data Archive, if not already, then very soon. And by the end of the project, all the data will be made public on the UK Data Archive. Just a word or two about the use of a quota sample. Obviously, this is something which I would not have chosen, but in the absence of access to one of the long-standing longitudinal studies, I mean, I've used the longitudinal studies, but they don't focus in the way we do on youth and the particular questions that we were interested in. In the absence of that, this quota sample was simply the only way of accessing in a quick way and a timely way our target population. So that has implications for what one can say statistically speaking. As you know, you can't really calculate proper confidence intervals. So our response to that is, well, we recognize that's a problem. And in fact, what we'll only discuss is findings which, if you like, would have been significant if it had been a probability sample. But everything we say has to be taken with that qualification in mind, as kind of indicative findings, but not a substantiated proof. Okay, so the key items for today's topic are the 2 questions that you can see there on the screen. This is the perceptions of skill loss. To what extent do you think your progress in learning job skills has been affected by the coronavirus pandemic? And I mean, there are at least 2 problems with asking about perceptions there. On the one hand, they are perceptions and subject to social esteem, so all kind of potential social biases there. And on the other hand, you're asking people to make quite a difficult calculation, which is to compare their current outcome with some kind of counterfactual. When you're asking what is the effect of something or other, you know, what would have happened if there hadn't been a pandemic? Nonetheless, that seemed to be the only way we could pose this the question we were asking. And I will say we had a pretty high response rate. Unfortunately, I should have had the number with me, but only a relatively small number, far less than 10%, did not answer this question. And that's a good sign. It's a good sign that people understood the question, were able to at least to make their own calculation in response to it. Now, the second question there is particularly focusing on people in education, and it's focusing on the wider question of overall educational progress. And related to that, we asked a couple of questions about their about their education satisfaction with the learning resources and the quality of teaching they were given. And I'll show you some results in respect of those questions as well. But it's fair to say that the real emphasis of the paper, the focus of the paper, is on the first question. For those people who are in employment, we asked, first of all, a standard question about training participation. This is pretty well the same question that's asked every 3 months in the quarterly labour force survey. And it used to feed into the EU quarterly labour force survey. But then there's a follow-up in terms of the duration, the number of hours they spent over the previous 4 weeks, and also whether it was leading to a qualification or a certification or anything. So there's two kind of, there's a volume thing there and a quality aspect as well. So now I think we're in a position to start looking at some of the main results in relation to our research questions. We'll start off with a few descriptive statistics because they in themselves are quite telling. So let's look at this. We divided the responses to the main question about learning job skills, the one on the previous slide. We divided the scale. Incidentally, there was a 5-point scale, I should have said this, which goes from something like worsened a lot, worsened a little, stayed the same as if there hadn't been a pandemic, and then improved a little and improved a lot. So we put the worsened, for this table, I put the worsened responses together and the improvement responses together so we can see what happens. So amongst all the sample, and this is pooling all the data from the first 3 waves, so you've got a sample of 3,000 here, you find that 46.9% say their acquisition of job skills has been worsened, 17% say better. So that is an unsurprising verdict, I think, on the COVID directly from the respondents themselves. But here's an interesting point. If you look at those people in education separately from those people employed, you see that amongst those people in education, the experience was very, very much worse. The balance is between 61 and 8. Whereas for those people in employment, something like 34% say things got worse as a result of the pandemic, but 27% say things got better. So that's interesting. Those people actually had jobs, don't seem to have been so badly scarred by the pandemic. There's also an unsurprisingly large gap for the non-employed, but I'm not going to say very much, if anything, more about the non-employed, simply because they're a pretty small group in the sample. Moving on to the subsidiary questions about educational progress and satisfaction. Again, we see a big balance between worse and better. This is just for those people in education. So this is, these people are ones who've suffered worst. 75 compared to 7, an enormous gap, indicating a big negative balance there. And this is mirrored by the story about satisfaction. What I did was to combine the 2 questions on education satisfaction. That's combining with, on the one hand, their their teaching quality and their perception of the resources that they were provided with. And low satisfaction was below 5 on the scale of 1 to 10, basically, which is pretty low by most satisfaction scales. And you see about a quarter of the sample have low satisfaction with the education they were being given, more amongst women than men. So that gives you a general picture of the sample. You can see the numbers here, about 1,160, 1,190 there. That's out of the total of 3,000, because this is just looking obviously at those people who are in education, whether they were in school or in college or university. And incidentally, I won't show you any results today, but there were not enormous differences between those people in university and those people in school in terms of their verdicts. They all report bad experiences. So what we have here now is the first attempt to try and model unfortunately it seems to, yeah, maybe you should be able to see it. Model the determinants of the perceived pandemic effects for those in education. And I've tried to distill some of the many results that we've got today, just to give you the general impression. And first of all, I want you to observe simply this top line here. We have the direct COVID encounter effects. In other words, those people, about 20, in the low 20%, I think it is, who actually had a direct COVID encounter. Let's say someone in their family, close family or friend, was seriously ill from COVID, then we see negative effects on their educational progress, and particularly on their satisfaction and on their learning of job skills. We shouldn't be surprised about that, but there it is, that's the effect. I think the interesting question we find here is looking at the kind of teaching that they had. There were 3 kinds. They could be doing all online, they could be having no teaching, and they could be having some hybrid teaching, some online, some face-to-face. And what you can see here, a couple of negative coefficients there, which are, would be significant if this were a probability sample, but these are substantially negatives. It's suggesting that those people who had all online teaching were not only worse than those people who had hybrid teaching, but actually worse than people who had no teaching. So that's quite an extraordinary verdict on their online teaching. Then an interesting result, that work experience is positive here. That is to say, some people who had either had some work placement from school, it's kind of mitigated effect. We've got a positive coefficient there. That's not that we shouldn't be surprised at. And then here's another effect here. Those children or young people who come from a low social grade household, this is the lowest social grade in the data, usually with unemployed parents and so on. We find that they're lacking in resources, and their perceived effects from the COVID are even worse than for the rest of us. So some interesting results there on education. The next question I want to look at is the effect on those people who were actually in employment. So if you're in employment, then on the one hand, you just might be having a worse experience of employment. And in particular, you might not be getting any training, whereas otherwise you might have been. even worse, you might have been placed on furlough. So there's some interesting questions there. What's the effect on the training? What's the effect on furlough? What's the effect of furlough on your skills experience? So to try and answer these questions, let's first look, actually just thought I'd take a visual look at the training story first. You may or may not know, some of you, that the long-term story in most parts of Britain for training is of a long-term declining trend in the volume of training. Now here you see it in this diagram, which actually follows from 2011 second quarter onwards, but actually goes back much further than that, as far as the late 1990s, that you find a declining volume of training amongst people in work. It's quite difficult to follow this because definitions change in the data sets over time. Here you see a more recent spell just from 2011 onwards, which is when the quarterly labour force survey started asking questions in a different way, but it's been asked in a consistent way since. And what we can see there is amongst young people, which is the black solid line there, aged 16 to 25, there's been not a great deal of change for the first part of the decade, but from about then onwards, really, I think you could say from 2014 onwards, you see a declining trend. And then you say, well, what about the pandemic period itself? Now, in previous economic crises, way back in the early 1990s, again, in the financial crisis of 2008, every time it comes up, people say that training is going to collapse. And every time this has happened, I've looked at it and find, perhaps surprisingly, relatively little effect. And that's exactly what happens here. You see the volume of training doesn't seem to, you can't see the pandemic really in this diagram. It's just pretty well constant. So we're going to have a closer look at that and what's behind it in a moment. Interestingly, amongst older people, we find these are older people in work, that is older in the sense of more than 25, it's all relative. You find even a slight uptick in the volume of training in the period between 22 and 21. Incidentally, these twos are because the duration of training is asked in the labour force survey only in the second quarter of every year. So we only have data for one quarter each year. So the first conclusion you can say from that is, actually, it looks like the volume of training doesn't seem to have been affected very much by the pandemic. And you say, well, that's a bit strange, because by the second quarter of 2021, we're certainly way into the period of the pandemic. Even by the second quarter of 2020, when we were in the first lockdown, we don't see any effect. So, yeah, I'll come back to the role of training in affecting skill perceptions soon. But the next question I want to look at is furlough. Now, I haven't got the figure on the top of my head, but hundreds of thousands of people in Britain were on the furlough scheme. The various different schemes have been operated in different countries. I'm actually not sure, I should know this, what kind of a scheme was operated in Ireland. But many people were placed on furlough, which essentially gave them full or large proportion of pay, but they had to stay at home. They were paid by the government, in effect, but they had to stay at home and not go to work. And we asked the question first, what happened for those people who were placed on furlough in terms of their participation in training? And you'd expect it to fall, wouldn't you? And there we see a 3% fall amongst young people, a 2 percentage point fall amongst older people, more or less as you might expect. Of course, because especially if the training is to take place at work, you can't go to work, you can't do any training. So that's kind of straightforward. So from this position, you'd expect to see something of a cut in training. Indeed, the normal participation rate in a 4-week period would be about 13%. So a 3 percentage point cut is a good 10% cut in the participation in training, quite substantial. I guess there's one other thing you might want to just notice from this particular regression, which is the timing, this is 2022. This is when the first wave of COVID was upon us, and you see immediately a cut in participation there. And this is what some early observers noticed and thought, oh my goodness, training is going to collapse as well. However, in subsequent years, in subsequent quarters of 2020, and again now in 2021, we find that negative has been neutralized and even becomes positive in later ones. So the early pessimistic position that was adopted by 1 or 2 writers seems to have not played out in the medium term as the pandemic progressed. So that's in terms of the volume. Now, let's have a look at this diagram, which looks not so much at participation in training, but the hours that trainees actually undertake. So the first 2 columns only look at people in work who have been doing some training and ask the question, what happens to the hours, the amount of hours that they report having done in the previous 4 weeks? And we've seen an enormous positive there, 22 hours for training amongst young people, and even a positive for older people as well. So what that's saying is that fewer people participated in training who were placed on furlough. But those people who were placed on furlough and did do some training did a lot more of it. So what I conclude from that is that if you were doing training of your own, whether it's at home or helped by an employer or not, you had a lot more time on your hands. The opportunity cost, obviously, of training was much reduced, and so you did a lot more of it. The kind of an optimistic perspective. And then if you combine the two and say, well, on average, what are the hours per employee, whether or not you're doing some training or no training? Well, you see there we have small numbers, statistically insignificant even with this quota sample. So amongst older people, even smaller. Amongst younger people, it's pretty negligible there. So that's why it seems that furlough is surprisingly not part of the story. It's kind of a non-story at the end of the day. Moving on. Yeah. So that's, I think, established the story, the narrative about what happened to training itself, whether just through the pandemic or specifically through being furloughed during the pandemic. Now let's look at the impact on the perception of skill loss amongst those people who are employed. And if we look at perhaps the final column, there's not a lot of difference between these 3 columns. It just kind of, I varied it in terms of the number of control variables included. The details are in the paper, but essentially we can just look at the final column, which has got the most control variables included. And there are a few that I've highlighted that I wanted to mention. So first of all, we see the direct COVID encounter effects. Those people in employment who had a direct COVID encounter, friend or family, they've been negatively affected. Unsurprisingly, people who participate in training, and it's kind of also much more significant when you combine not only training participation, but training for a qualification. There's quite a substantial effect there. Put those two effects together, it's about 0.3. So if you're doing training and it's leading to a qualification, that also mitigates your perception skill loss, not surprisingly. Skipping down to here, we see the furloughed. Those people furloughed, no effect whatsoever again. So again, it's not such a bad thing if you were furloughed. Here's the luck effect, what I call it luck, the bad luck to be in a lockdown industry. We defined a lockdown industry as an industry which involved for at least 50% of the time working at work in other words, you couldn't do it at home. And in effect, this meant the hospitality industry, the food and beverage industry, and the retail industry. So 3 large industries there. And you find a notable negative there. So those people who happen to be in the wrong industry, and a lot of young people were in those industries, they had a bad experience, even if they were in work. Finally, I did look at occupations, and the thing which stood out here is those people who were in managerial occupations, those young people in managerial occupations, obviously not a large sample, but I guess these will be people hoping to, heading to be high flyers in the long term. And the typical sort of occupation where you'd be doing lots of training in the early years, yeah, their perceptions are actually that they've improved compared to many other occupations. Final observation, no, sorry, two more observations from this this particular model is this is a negative for long-term health constraint. Those people had a long-term health constraint, lacking in certain resources to deal with the shock of the pandemic, a negative there as you'd expect. And then further down here is that gender effect, which I was looking for, not hoping for, as it were, but potentially expecting in the light of many of the gender differences and gender gaps which have been reported in terms of behavior during the pandemic. And it seems like that the young female people in work feel that they were worse affected by the pandemic than the males, up to a certain extent. So those are some of the detailed results. Let me just finish with a couple of slides with some broader comments about what this shows. The first question is it okay to use subjective perceptions data, I guess? And personally, I think it is, as long as you don't oversell what one's finding here. Basically, this was the only way we could think of actually getting data, even if we'd had lots more money, actually getting data on the loss of learning of job skills. But of course, there are disadvantages. We know that some people are much more pessimistic, so they give you a pessimistic story, whatever they're talking about, and other people are a lot more optimistic. And as I mentioned earlier on, there's the problem of asking people to think of their present situation in relation to a counterfactual, a hypothetical counterfactual, which is difficult at the best of times. Nevertheless, I would say that some of our findings are precisely consistent with what you might expect. So it has a certain validating value there. And I think we have to just take these results for what they are. A second observation I would make is I think I personally was a little bit surprised about the mildness of the effects amongst those in work. Obviously, there are concerns for those in the lockdown industries, and there is that concern over the gender difference. But on the whole, the gap between the improvers and the deteriorators, as it were, amongst those people in work was rather smaller, I think, than I expected. There were quite a lot of people, at least 1 in 4 of those people in work, who thought that their experience had actually got better as a result of the pandemic. And then the other result is that, really going back to those descriptive tables right at the beginning, the experience is so much worse, or has been so much worse for those in education. I think perhaps that the unluckiest group of all were those people who are in the first year of their college experience when the pandemic broke, and obviously had to become locked down in their halls of residence and so on. But it seems to have been exacerbated by those who, for those people who were particularly confined to online learning only. And I guess the last result, which one might stress to anybody, is that work experience is always good. As you might expect, work experience is good, but it seems like any form of work experience, whether we looked at work placements, internships, or even volunteering, they all seem to give us a positive perception of the skill loss. In other words, reducing the skill loss if somebody had some kind of work experience. Finally, I should obviously repeat, I think, the limitations. We are dealing with quota data here, and so I cannot at all swear by the significance of these results because technically speaking, those confidence intervals don't mean anything. But beyond that, going back to the subjective objective distinction that I made, or the fact that we're dealing with subjective data, it would have been nice if we'd had more opportunity to, at least in some areas, confirm the subjective reports, but we didn't have that. And then, of course, the other thing to say is that this has only been based on the first 3 waves of the data up till the end of July, over 6 months ago. There will, by the end, that'll be, say, by the 6th wave is actually going into operation in a month or so. We will have all 6 waves of data in 2 or 3 months' time. And when we have that, I would hope to extend this a little bit and look more on some of the social class distinctions than we've been able to up till now. As you can appreciate, we've only had 3,000 observations. By the end, we should have 6,000. And so that enables you to get a little bit more disaggregated and detailed in one's investigations. So that's it. Thanks, of course, to the Economic and Social Research Council, which gave us the money to conduct this analysis and to conduct the survey. I'm very much looking forward to any questions or points of clarification.